Kamala Harris, as the vice president behind Joe Biden in the United States, has clearly been a positive influence on environmentalism and the sectors that benefit from the fight against climate change. But at the same time, there's a very real possibility that Donald Trump will be elected in November. And this video is not meant to take a political stance, but this will be a review of what a Trump presidency might mean for green investments. Let's review Trump's environmental record in his first term, and then we'll discuss what he might do in his second potential term and which industries he would negatively impact.
We will end the Biden-Harris war on American energy, and we will drill, baby, drill. We're going to start that day one.
As you know, if you follow American politics, Trump is very friendly with both the oil and gas sector as well as the coal industry, so most of the actions he's going to take will work in their best interest. But he's also made it clear that he will withdraw from most environmental efforts that he sees as unnecessary or too costly. In Trump's first presidential term, he made it incredibly clear that he thought the Paris Agreement was a cost that America shouldn't have to pay. It took 3 years to make it happen, but he did pull out of the agreement toward the end of his term. Of course, the agreement's main goal is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Pulling out of that treaty is exemplary of his thoughts on climate change as a whole. The US pledges $3 billion annually to the Global Green Climate Fund under the United Nations. The fund's main goal is to provide funding for developing countries to adapt to climate change. Trump pulled out of that fund when he was president and vows to do it again in a new term. Other negative actions during his term include relaxing EPA rules around leak detection and maintenance of hydrofluorocarbons, which are considered a super pollutant. He weakened coal carbon emission standards under the EPA and took steps to try to repeal the Clean Power Plan, which was ultimately struck down by the Supreme Court in 2022. That was Obama's plan for the EPA, which was focused on reducing emissions from fossil fuel power plants. Other regulations were rolled back by Trump during his term, but the ones I just mentioned were most of the major ones to consider. And of course, thanks to the Supreme Court justices that Trump elected previously, we've seen the Chevron doctrine overturned. I made a video on this when it happened for those interested in a more in-depth explanation, but in summary, the Chevron doctrine was a precedent set in the courts that judges should defer to the expertise of an involved federal agency if some language in a law was vague. The agencies like the EPA, for example, would interpret what the wording meant. Now that precedent was overridden, so judges have more authority to interpret the laws how they wish. This was seen as a blow to the environmental movement because some of the rules passed by the EPA and other organizations might be increasingly threatened by litigation in the courts over legal authority. And again, I'm not here to say whether any of these things are right or wrong, I'm just laying out the facts. So with some background on the actions Trump took in his first term, we can set some expectations for what he might be likely to do in a second term. The Biden administration recently passed new emission standards for light and medium-duty vehicles, which would effectively mandate that nearly half of new vehicles sold by 2030 would be electric. This is the primary policy that Trump has mentioned he would revoke in his policies on his website. That's the only time he mentions something environmental on there at all. In further comments, he's been adamant that he wants to eliminate a new power plant emissions rule, which would essentially require most new coal and gas power plants to install carbon capture systems by 2032. Obviously, if that policy took effect, this would provide a massive growth tailwind for the carbon capture industry in the US over the next decade. Inevitably, Trump will likely pull out of the Paris Agreement again as well, and even the Inflation Reduction Act could be in danger. At the very least, he's talked about getting rid of certain tax benefits or funding from the bill, so he would start gutting it. Benefits that would be particularly at risk would be the tax credit for EVs, which Trump hasn't made a decision on yet, and another tax credit for manufacturing facilities associated with reducing emissions, as well as the fee for methane emitters of $900 per metric ton of methane emissions. Assume that if some benefit or subsidy is included in the IRA or another climate change related bill or policy from the federal government, it could be at risk. Ironically, as Bloomberg has pointed out, Republican states have been the largest beneficiaries of the funding and additional investment spurred by the IRA. States like Arizona, Georgia, and Texas are clear targets for renewable energy and other green projects, creating an interesting dynamic. We could see pressure from these red states to actually leave the IRA alone for the most part, and that would be something to watch if Trump wins. Now, as you can imagine, Trump isn't going to benefit most environmental industries, but we can identify which sectors will be affected negatively and which ones will largely be unaffected if he wins. I've compiled the list of sectors that I cover in my newsletter about green markets into 2 sections. the industries that Trump will likely hurt, and which ones will likely be unaffected, or could even stand to gain from bipartisan political support regardless of who wins. We'll start with the list of what Trump hurts, which would include biofuels, carbon capture, carbon markets, hydrogen, electric vehicles, as well as the battery sector and renewable energy producers. Most of these sectors are heavily dependent on government support to reach financial viability. This typically comes in the form of tax credits or funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and other bills that could be in danger if Trump wins. If an industry is reliant on tax credits, especially anything capital intensive to build out with large infrastructure projects, it could be wise to avoid those if Trump wins. Even without Trump doing anything, these complex projects have been having issues with growing input costs, supply chain delays, and increased interest rates. Generally speaking, I like to avoid capital-intensive industries entirely due to the variety of issues they can face. For example, Plug Power is one of the largest hydrogen infrastructure developers in the United States. They've received billions of dollars in tax credits or subsidies, and they have never recorded a profitable quarter. The company's been around since 1997. It could easily never be profitable, ever. That's the type of company and industry I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. And the one industry I mentioned that isn't very capital intensive in most instances, the carbon markets, is unfortunately dependent on the government in both compliance and voluntary markets. Sentiment is a major driver of commerce in these markets, and Trump pulling the US out of climate initiatives around the globe certainly would not be a positive. Now, I'm not sure how much of an impact he would really have. The carbon markets are global, but again, not a positive, obviously. On the other hand, there are a decent amount of industries that would largely remain unaffected if Trump were to gain power. Sectors that would be fine include agriculture and agritech, battery metals, liquefied natural gas, nuclear energy, recycling technology, and water companies. These are industries that tend to hold bipartisan support from both the left and right of the political spectrum. Trump has particularly mentioned that he's quite supportive of LNG and nuclear energy. He recently endorsed expediting new energy projects, singling out nuclear energy and small modular reactors at one of his rallies. He did provide support to some of the industries during his term, like announcing a plan to spend $1.5 billion over 10 years to build up a uranium reserve to revive the mining industry. The Trump administration also invested $100 million to increase biofuel sales to help support farmers. He also signed Save Our Seas 2.0, which provided $55 million in funding through 2025 to improve plastic recycling management. Yet these are just a few examples. So he will provide support to these industries, but obviously probably not to the same degree the Democrats would with their spending packages like the IRA. Trump seems to be more focused on infrastructure in a broader sense, like roads and bridges. Of course, environmental investments will benefit the most from the Democrats retaining power, but I tend to look for investments that hold bipartisan support and are not capital intensive, meaning companies that don't need to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build new facilities to produce electric vehicles or complex infrastructure like hydrogen pipelines. I'll make another video reviewing Kamala's policies on the environment if she ever provides details on what they are, because she currently still hasn't shared any on her website. If you'd like to learn about specific investment opportunities in these green industries and important news events that affect them, then consider subscribing to my newsletter on Substack, which will be linked in the description. I have a variety of stock lists over there for all the green sectors mentioned in this video, along with investment write-ups, all for paid members. Thanks for watching.